And we are live. We've got a lot of viewers in. 38 viewers. That's a new record, actually. I suppose I'll have more people vote on future streams if we're going to get this many people in. How is everyone doing? I'm going to mute the bit on my end. So today we're going to be doing a bit of a talk, as I'm sure you can tell, why capitalism and communism both lead to tyranny. And they're for different reasons. In fact, very, very different reasons. The thing is that, to make this very clear, first of all, by capitalism I don't mean purely the ownership of private property, which we'll define in a little bit. The Wikipedia definition for it is useless, so we're not going to be talking about that. Whereas communism in itself is something that is impossible because of the very basic mistakes it makes in its first principles. Capitalism is something that can be worked with on some level, but there are some things that we need to be aware of, because it's not a self-sustaining system. Okay. Hans Hermann Hoppe says, hint, they both don't have the right teleology. That's part of it. The other one is, just to answer George Washington's question, it's a painting post the siege of Jerusalem. I can't remember the name of the artist, but it is of the aftermath of the siege of Jerusalem. I'm sure you can find it pretty easily. Yeah, Wikipedia does not have a very good definition of capitalism. So, it's occurred to me that this is probably going to be a video that gets some flack, and I'm sure that people are going to want to debate me on it, because I've had people have a go at me in real life for my attitude towards capitalism in my own friend circles. So if you have anybody in mind who you want to come on and debate me, maybe not on this stream but on a subsequent stream, I'd be more than happy to talk to them. So we will start with communism, because communism is probably the most egregious of the two. In fact, definitely the most egregious of the two, for a number of reasons. And that is because it is an impossible system, because it is just straight up false. Capitalism in itself is grounded somewhat in reality, but communism philosophically is grounded in falsehood. Now, how is this the case? Well, it's because the young Hegelians, led by Marx, assumed that the entire world was material. They assumed that the world was physicalistic. Marx took from Hegel his theory of history in a certain sense, but then based it on materialism as opposed to the idealism of Hegel. So for the differences, idealism is essentially the belief that all things are immaterial, which means that they're spirit. They're without matter in the sense that we think of it. Whereas materialism believes that everything on some level is founded on atoms, on matter. Now, this is simply not true, for a number of reasons, but we won't focus on so much debunking communism, because history's done a good enough job of that. Suffice it to say, in the beginning, God made the heaven and the earth was without form, and the Spirit moved across the face of the waters, right? God was materialistic in the beginning. We know this from Genesis, if we were to use a scriptural argument. Aside from that, I'd probably say something along the lines of, well, matter has inherent laws of physics. Which came first? Because the laws themselves are clearly immaterial. And likewise, how do we define being independent of matter? There is no being in itself if there is matter in the beginning. There's also no inherent properties that we can abstract from anything that we observe. But that's just by the by. The important part is focusing on why this is pragmatically difficult, because these are kind of pie-in-the-sky ideas for 90% of people, and it's not really something that they're inherently bothered by. The problem is that it denies part of man. It denies 2/3 of man, according to someone like Plato, because it denies that man has a spirit, and it denies that he has a soul, a rational intellect. It denies spirituality has any meaning whatsoever, which is evidently not the case. Entire societies are founded on some form of spirituality. particularly the Christian life. And we can see this in the works that Marx wrote even before the Communist Manifesto of 1848, through his work on religion. I can't remember the title, where he coins religion as the opiate of the masses, which was something that was tremendously false, because as we have seen since that time, we have had the bloodiest century in human history in the form of the 20th, and that is because he undermined any sort of transcendent authority to set rules. Now, somebody like Nietzsche may have declared that God was dead. Obviously, we know that God is very much alive and has been watching this the whole time and has been permitting this. But that doesn't change the fact that this inherent hatred of religion in Marxism, and therefore in communism and socialism and anything that comes from that, hobbles societies, because it denies part of man. You cannot have a society that is good without acknowledging that part of man. I should probably define tyranny first, because the Greeks used to think of tyranny as essentially any unjustified dictatorship. This is not that. I'm talking about bad government, broadly speaking. Although, of course, if you've got an inherently materialistic society where that's the only thing that matters, you're going to have a lot of squabbles. It's going to be might makes right, because there's no transcendent rules. It also keeps people trapped in material things. So people who live in a Marxist society, they are not allowed to acknowledge the growth of virtue, which is something immaterial, beyond those prescribed proletarian values of, say, hard work, or such things that produce material good for the community. Humans living under a socialist system are not allowed to acknowledge things that are immaterial in value and are not able to be sold or held in one's hands or anything. And so it keeps man's focus in his life very, very limited, beyond what man is supposed to. On top of this, we have his theory on history, which is essentially entirely materialistic. Likewise, this is the primary problem with communism. There are tons of others, but this is the primary problem. It's entirely based on material, and it outright denies, because of its materiality, it denies human free will. It talks about a progression from primitive communism through feudalism, through capitalism, through to socialism, which is the mass ownership of the means of production by the state, and the eventual quote withering away of the socialist system into true communism. I believe it was Friedrich Engels who talks of that, who talks of the withering away of the state. Lenin in State and Revolution says that this would be violent. I seem to recall him saying that anyway. Whereas Engels and others believed it would be peaceful. But regardless, there's no room for God in any of this, hence denying the telos of the universe. And on top of that, you have the denial of human free will as well. So if man cannot do anything to change history, then why bother? It's the same problem of the very low-res Calvinism that has sort of degenerated out of what Calvin originally thought over the last 500 years, where it's a once saved, always saved kind of thing. Well, if you're always saved, then why work on virtue? Why work on merit? Why do anything in relation to the spiritual life? And likewise, if you can't influence history at all, why do anything at all? If you're just carried along by material flows of history, why bother? But of course, this reductionist view of history, it assumes that people will just do that anyway, and they may well do, based on the temperaments of their bodies. But when a thinking man embraces this, it assumes that, well, you can't do anything about it, therefore just go through life, indulge in what the body wants. So it degenerates man. And finally, I've gotten written down here in my notes, we have the fourth stage of Marxist stage theory, and that is the fourth stage of socialism, where there is overwhelming state control and management of the economy, ownership of the means of production, And this is supposedly a solution to the admittedly very pronounced problem of the mid-19th century of the mass ownership of the means of production by a tiny class of capitalists. Now, the trouble with the mass ownership of the means of production is that, as Aristotle realised, because Plato believed that everything could be held in common and everyone would view it as theirs and therefore they'd protect it, Aristotle realised that if everything was owned in the possession of the entire commune, then it would be nobody's, really, because if everyone owns it, then nobody owns it, and therefore it would degrade and decay, and so therefore there'd be less of an incentive to protect what's yours, because if everyone else owns it, well, hey-ho, it's not really mine, is it? Which is, interestingly, another thing that damages the ability for somebody to work hard, as much as the state might encourage it. And so you have a reduction in virtue, and as societies get less virtuous, they degenerate more and more because they're unable to form the basis of the society, and that is the family. If you have people who cannot work, or will not work in a capacity where they think they can be rewarded because they don't own anything, then that's going to naturally lead to laziness, and laziness leads to careless consumption of things, be that bread, which I understand was frowned on in the Soviet Union. But this consumption of bread leads to sexual degeneracy. As you know, it seems like it's something that people have missed, right? In the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel links the surfeit or surplus of bread in Sodom and Gomorrah to the increasing degeneration of the people in that society. Because if you can't even resist a slice of toast, how are you going to resist something sexual? And likewise, you saw this with communist societies to the point where, in fact, it happened so quickly that Lenin had to intervene in the mid-1920s to put in place laws banning such actions. In fact, I think one of the things that kept the communist state going may have actually been the artificial famines, because it meant that people couldn't relapse into such awful vices. It forced people to be more virtuous, because if you're fasting, then you have a higher fortitude, and people who have higher fortitude stand up to punishment more. That's why a lot of the people from the former Soviet bloc are seen as tougher than people from the West. And that's essentially my criticism of communism right there. That's the whole thing, as far as I've gotten written down. Capitalism is an entirely different kettle of fish. Because in itself, in the Wikipedia definition, the ownership of the means of production by individuals for the sake of profit, that's not a bad thing. That's existed since the beginning of time. This existed under the Roman Empire, this existed under the Ottomans, this has existed since year dot in some form or another. But that's not really a very good definition. Marx's definition is far more interesting, and I actually agree with him in this regard. And we will talk about that first before we get into the more pertinent issues of modern capitalism. Normally, well, strictly speaking, the problem of supply and demand and how to approach this, because that's the root of the issue. That's probably the most fundamental part of capitalist theory that I think should be looked at. So, Marx, being around in the 1840s, 50s through to I believe the 1880s, he lived in a world where a very tiny minority of people owned the vast majority of the industry. And it was very different from the world that we find ourselves in now, because the vast majority of people nowadays in modern Western countries are very middle class. They live relatively comfortable lives. In the 1840s and 50s, this was not the case. The cities had only just started to receive huge numbers of people from the countryside looking for industrial work. Because, well, for a number of reasons, but there was trouble holding on to land because the landowners kept buying it up. There was more money to be made in the cities, and such things as that. There was more opportunity in the cities, so you had this mass influx of human capital into the cities, where they'd work in the manufactories of, or factories as we call them, of this tiny ruling class who had enough money to establish them. Now, this leads to a system of government which, I believe it's in Book 9 of the Republic. It's been a very long time since I've read Plato in any capacity. He'd have called this oligarchy, because you have a huge swarming class of people dependent on the governance of oligarchs. Now, the oligarchs, at least in Britain, had been in control of the country since at the very latest 1688, with the Glorious Revolution and the deposing of the last Catholic monarch of Britain, James II. And people like Seaborn Rowntree and the like did studies into the poverty that this led to, but it's important because ultimately Marxist criticism is aimed at oligarchy, or the mass ownership of the means of production by a tiny class of oligarchs, which we still have to some extent, but not to the extent that they had back then, because people were in just disgusting levels of poverty. There were mass outbreaks of cholera all over London. People lived in squalid conditions, working very, very long shifts because they needed that amount of money to survive. There was, of course, there was even such levels of human suffering that it stunted people's growth. People were shorter in the 18th and 19th century than they are now because of the poor quality of their diets, the poor quality of all of their accommodations and such. And understandably, there was a lot of resentment against this. Oliver Twist. Yeah, Oliver Twist is one of the ones that Luxet Lex mentions. Yeah, of course it was a more two-dimensional picture than just suffering everywhere in the industrial hellhole of London, Birmingham, Sheffield and such. You of course had families like the Bournevilles in Birmingham who built an entire town for the sake of their workers, called Bourneville. Cadbury's, not the Bournevilles. Cadbury built a town called Bourneville for the sake of their workers. There were good, well, quote-unquote good, industrialists who provided for their workers. But this was how Marx viewed things. And he was right to observe that this massive monopoly on power, on the power of work, on the power of production, in the hands of a tiny class would lead to exploitation. Of course it would. You know, you're not going to mess around, say, the bouncer at the nightclub if you're a tiny little guy who can't stand up to him, and likewise in economic circumstances. So you've got the locus of control against the masses in society. You don't have the majority of people holding the power. You have oligarchs who are ultimately driven by greed. And as we know from St. Paul, greed is of the devil. A lot of them are driven by greed anyway, of course not all. I'm speaking in generalities here. And they have every motivation to hold on to their power, which makes sense. So, you have a system where you have maybe... Whoops, just dropped my pen. Where you have maybe 1, 2, 3% of the population controlling 90% of the wealth. So that encourages predation because they've got overwhelming power. We see this nowadays in the forms of buyouts, because a lot of the time you'll see things like tech companies buying up little startups and then smothering them. And also you see the oligarchs being interested in suppressing any sort of competition economically that they might face from innovation, and so it's in their direct interest to spread vice. But only insofar as it impacts the effectiveness of their workers. That's why it's potentially in the best interest of some of the industrialists to spread things like pornography. Now, I suppose pornography is better than something like alcohol, because while alcohol completely debilitates someone, pornography really doesn't. It very rarely does. But it drains people of their energy in such a way that they're not going to innovate. In fact, I think it's J.D. Unwin that actually says it destroys the... Was it J.D.? No, I don't think it was J.D. Unwin. Either way, it destroys their ability to form families as well, which means that they're more likely to be loyal to the companies owned by the oligarchs. Because if you have a family, you're going to be loyal to that first and foremost, aside from God. Oh, another thing they might want to attack. Yeah. Yeah, so you see, if you've got workers who are loyal and you control the society, you might as well subvert their thought. Now, one thing I haven't actually got written down here, but it's just popped into my head. Well, you have this class of conservatives on quotes. I'm thinking of TP USA, Turning Point USA, Turning Point UK, and this kind of capitalism is for everyone kind of mentality. Now, the problem with this is that the majority of people simply aren't born entrepreneurs. There were, of course, a very large number of self-employed people, even in 1900 in America, much more than there are now. But these weren't entrepreneurs in the way that, say, Charlie Kirk is thinking of them. They were people like maybe not Towns blacksmith, but they were small shop owners in some cases, craftsmen, such and such, right? They weren't competing in a world with large corporations out in the countryside, right? Whereas nowadays they most certainly are, and they were just there because they were the one person who made clothes or whatever. I doubt that they would really be able to do that nowadays. People just aren't temperamentally suited. Most people, anyway, are not temperamentally suited to the kind of high demands that modern entrepreneurship have. I realised that at university, because I entered university thinking, and having seen, a lot of people, maybe a vast majority of the people I went to school with in secondary school, had the sort of temperament that would make them really good contract workers. People who work and run building companies, plumbing companies, HVAC kind of stuff. Like just generally self-employed workers in skilled fields. Most people don't have that temperament. So you can't really say that to people because it's like, well, it's not in their programming to do that. You can't base an entire society on competition because a lot of people just simply can't play because they're just not dispositionally suited to it. A lot of them just want to sit down. They just want to grill, They just want to grill. And society should let them do that because the thing that a lot of these capitalists say is, well, it's all science. Economics is a science. No, it's not. It's a moral philosophy. It has assumptions in it which can be founded on scientific evidence, of course. But the principles themselves are philosophical. So this tiny class owning the majority of the means of production is a bad thing because of that exploitation, the character of the people under them, and their just self-interest. They're not interested in tolerating any sorts of people who would oppose them, maybe compete for things. And to sort of quote this title of a book called Blue Ocean Strategy, there's only so many blue oceans. I'll explain what that means. So Blue Ocean Strategy is a business strategy book that suggests that entrepreneurs and business leaders should look for new markets to go for. Because there's this thing called a red ocean, and a red ocean is where there's lots of competition. In other words, there's a lot of fighting going on, but there isn't really much profit being made because each side is focused on stabbing the other. Whereas if you have a blue ocean, well, you've got the complete market share if you start a company to expand into before, and you'll have that for quite a while, potentially, until other competitors spring up. Peter Thiel actually uses this business model in 0 to 1 as well, in a less explicit sense. So even business strategists believe, this competition thing, you should probably avoid it. Now that's one criticism that's been solved to some extent, because frankly people are nowhere near as miserable as they were in the mid-19th century. At least the working class aren't. They're miserable in a different way, maybe, is the best way of putting it. Some of these middle class, clerk types, accountants and such are living relatively comfortable lives. Some people are out in the underclass addicted to drugs and such, which is actually a good segue into the second point on capitalism, which is the principle of supply and demand. So supply and demand is supply and demand, right? You want to fill demand because people will buy the product. And if you can work on something, you can produce a greater supply, and it can vary. The trouble is with capitalism as a system is that because it has no morality inherent to it, whereas communism conceivably could have ethics linked to the materialism of communism that could be come up with separately. I think Freud did something like this. Capitalism doesn't have this inherent to it. And in fact, it actually encourages the kind of behaviour that would attack the pre-existing morality of Europe in, say, 1750, the Christian, Protestant, Catholic moralities that were around. So let's consider this, for example. What are the most simple things that human beings desire? Not what they need, what they desire. Well, they desire food. They desire water. Those things are great. They desire comfort of some form. Again, perfectly fair enough. They desire sex. Wait, what? Sex? Sex? Is that something that we want to provide a supply to satiate the demand of, necessarily? Now, what could that lead to if we did this in an uncontrolled manner? Well, this could lead to a proliferation of women who believe that they can make a lot of money through men who desire that particular aspect of themselves. And not only do you have, in that case, a lot of women who are going to find it much harder to form families, the base rock of society, you've also got a lot of women who feel like they've been degraded. They probably didn't think that far ahead. Funnily enough, economic entities are not rational. We should not pretend they are, because human beings aren't rational. And you've also got a bunch of men who are wasting their time with these women and again not forming families, as well as all of the net results of fulfilling lust. Lust dulls the intellect and such. What about alcohol? If you have a huge amount of alcohol that's incredibly cheap, you will end up with people who are dragged into alcoholism. In fact, I think one of the most notable examples of this is that there was a group of people in the Polish Commonwealth that created a huge alcohol dependency problem amongst, I think it was the Polish peasants. And that destroyed their ability to work and eventually led to reactions to them. We see this to some extent with drug problems, right? You have all of these people who are addicted to meth, addicted to cocaine, addicted to weed. And yes, I'm going to say addicted to weed because although maybe you could argue the compound itself isn't addictive, habits are indeed addictive. That's how habits work. So it's about satisfying the correct demands of the people, and that's where the morality comes in. There needs to be a morality behind the capitalism. Then there's no problem whatsoever with people, of course, producing things for people to consume and owning those things outright. Fair enough. No one has a problem with that aside from the communists and crazy people. It's about what demands you decide to fill. There's always going to be a demand for slaves. For example, even in a relatively modern country like Britain, there's a city called Leicester, and something like 12% of the population are actual slaves. There was a report the other week which suggests that there is indeed a demand for slaves amongst British people. Do you think that that is a good thing to fulfill? Do you think that that might reinforce the increasingly strong idea that human beings have no inherent dignity? What about pornography? Like we've mentioned, there's an incredibly high demand for sexual pleasure amongst people. Should this be fulfilled, or would this objectively damage society? Well, of course it would, because it degrades the individual morality, and whatever degrades the individual morality is inevitably going to have systemic effects. Likewise with drugs, as I've mentioned earlier on. We have to consider what demands are worth filling and what demands should be filled. And capitalism in itself does not provide this. There must be a moral system. There must be a moral system associated with it. And otherwise, you get something like Rapture from Bioshock 1 and 2. In addition, should supplies always be exploited in cases where the demands are just? Is it always good to free up all of the supply of oil at a given moment because there's huge demand for it? What about if there's only a finite amount of oil and we know for definite that that's all there is? Is it always good to do that? Is it always good to... I really don't like using environmentalist terms, but say the rainforest, right? There's only a limited amount of trees. We can, of course, regrow them. But is there any sense in destroying that natural environment for the sake of powering factories? How about... Yeah, that's one. Vaccines. There are some vaccines that rely on fetal tissue. Is it alright to create a supply of that fetal tissue through abortion? Because I've heard of at least some vaccines that rely on that aborted fetal tissue and stem cells from, indeed, abortions to provide for medical, for the medical industry, right? Is that a good thing to do? No, of course it isn't, because it's murder. And that's the major problem with capitalism. If it's unchecked, it allows people to behave like demons. Because you have no restrictions on people at all in what they can sell and buy. You have all of this literature about that describes in very great detail how human beings function, what their lowest appetites are. And so why not exploit that if there's no overarching morality? And that's the problem with capitalism in the modern age, right? You have no moral system behind it. And finally, human capital. If you have a huge number of human beings with, say, menial skills, is it alright to exploit that and to offer the lowest wage possible? In fact, this is actually really pertinent, right? Well, maybe not right now, but because over the last 20 odd years, we've outsourced a lot of things to Vietnam and to India and to China because they have much lower human wages, and these people are treated like slaves. Is that just? Is it just that we should treat human beings as capital and therefore pay them the absolute bare minimum? To such a point where they cannot see their children, cannot sustain families. It's like taking what unlimited capitalism does is it's essentially taking the sponge that is society and squeezing the water out of it slowly, right? Taking the water in a bucket and then using it, selling it to someone, or using it to wash itself, and then just goes down the drain. It's gone, right? It's great if you have checks and balances on the system. But on its own, it's not sufficient. You need another moral philosophy behind it, because on its own, it just destroys societies. So, where do we find ourselves right now in society? We find ourselves in a society that has an increasingly undefined view of morality. I was reading a book on Aristotle, something like Saving Politics from Philosophy, by a University of Oxford professor called Alan Ryan. And I went through and I read his views on Aristotle, and aside from making some of the least convincing arguments against slavery that I've ever seen, he's very clever, this guy, because he's an Oxford scholar and you can tell. He says, Aristotle and these old moralists, he doesn't mention specifically other moralists besides Plato and Machiavelli, and I think he mentions Aquinas very briefly. These people had good ideas of what morality was. It was rigidly defined. Now we don't have that, and as a consequence, ethical arguments are a lot more fluffy. They don't really have the oomph that they had in, say, the books written by St. Thomas Aquinas, or St. Bonaventure, or, for that matter, Aristotle himself. And so we live in a society, of course, where this lack of definition, of course, leads to smudging of the behaviour of people in ownership of the means of production. You have the creation of apps like Tinder, Grindr, you have OnlyFans. You have, of course, people who are interested in getting people hooked onto weed. and the society at large being entirely, disarmed of virtue by virtue, funnily enough, of the slow collapse of religion, has no way to react. And so you just end up with this society that is addicted to its lower passions and therefore has difficulty raising families. Aside from the abortion issue, where people are literally murdering their children, is it any wonder that we don't really have the same marriage rates that we once did? No, because people are too interested in fulfilling their lower passions. The people are less virtuous, and capitalism in itself does not provide a solution. Now, two alternatives. Well, actually, I've got a number of alternatives. I'll talk about what I think should be done in a moment, but we'll talk about two examples of solutions. The first one is the Platonic Solution. The solution from, I believe it's book 9 and 10 of Plato's Republic, where he talks about the historical progression of societies, which is actually a lot more accurate than what Marx came up with. You begin with aristocracy, the rule of the best, then timocracy, which is the rule essentially of the military elite. So it's the rule of the brain of society going to the rule of the spirit of society, which is, the soldiers. The most spirited people are often soldiers. Then you have oligarchy, which is rule of those with money, which is what has been the case for at least a few hundred years. Although increasingly we are the next stage, which is democratic, which is essentially mob rule in Plato's view, which we are often sitting in right now, where the virtue of the society is such that the appetites rule the society as opposed to, say, the spirit of the soldiers, the virtues that come with honour. And with aristocracy, where it's the rule of those who are most interested in studying the world for what it actually is. We are in that democratic stage right now. It seems very fitting that somebody like Winston Churchill, who was undoubtedly read on all of these people, believed that democracy was the worst system aside from all of the others. Because he was somebody who was very much appetitive in his behaviour. And we see this indeed with the behaviours in America at the moment. You see a lot of people acting on their appetites. A lot of people want to steal. A lot of people want to just, do unspeakable acts in the street. I'm sure a lot of you have seen videos of people twerking and doing other things just in full view of police. And that's because we as a society have been reduced to just an absence of virtue. And what comes after this democracy is tyranny. And you get, in this case, rulers that are entirely without moral control. You end up with people like Caligula, who made his consul a horse. You have people like Nero, who murdered his mother. You have all sorts of very strange things. You have Caracalla, who I believe... I actually can't remember exactly what he did. I think it was something pretty grim and sexual with his own family, but I can't remember that for certain. And we are due for that kind of behaviour. And I can't remember if Plato thinks this is unavoidable or not, because it's been 4 years since I've read it. But it's looking like we're going to go there if we don't change the way that people behave. Yeah, basically I'm recapping a recent article by Edward Fazer, as Franzel mentioned in the chat. I will grab that actually during the break which we're about to have. The second alternative is Aristotle, who believes that the best kind of society is something called the polity, which is where there's a rule of a few, but rule consists in balancing all of the desires of all the different classes. So a balance providing for the oligarchs, providing for the democrats, providing for the aristocrats, so that everyone is kind of, somewhat balanced. And the apotheosis of this would be the tripartite state that was in pre-revolutionary France. For those who don't know, in France there were 3 estates. The first estate, which were the clergy. The second estate, which were the soldiers, well, not the soldiers specifically, the nobles. And then the third estate were everyone else. the bourgeoisie in its early form, the peasantry and such. These are different tax brackets, and that's what we were taught in school. But what we didn't know is the theory behind this, because Plato had something similar, where he had, those who pray, those who work, and those who fight. And these are essentially the three classes that run society in this case. But we don't have any of these. Everyone's just meshed into one. This would be the ideal way of running things, because there are decidedly those who are very good at thrift, who are the majority of people. The majority of people are appetitive, and so they fit into the third estate. You have a smaller class of people who deeply respect honour and virtue in itself, and they fit into the second estate. Because although they may not have spendthrift and hard work per se, they do have these attitudes of honour. These would tend to be the ruling classes in more in democracies and such, and they would constitute the nobility. And then finally you have those who are interested in the true essence of things, that being God and the Holy Trinity and the angels and the studies of scriptures and prayer and those things that keep society bounded together that we simply don't have anymore. At least not for the majority of people. And that would be the first estate, that would be the priests. We have this in the form of people who have studied far too much physics and, say, computer science now, but they really aren't a priestly caste. I think it's a great shame that people like St. Thomas Aquinas have been replaced by this caste of tremendously arrogant computer programmers, frankly. And I say this as a computer programmer primarily, first and foremost. We should not run society. But before I quickly head off, I think we've zeroed in on the problem. It is about the security of a fundamental ethical and moral philosophy that we can secure for our society. What can we do to restore the state? What can we do to sustain this state of affairs? Well, everyone is immoral, and we need to point it all out. Everyone is. Because the thing is, you have these people making these self-righteous moral crusades, and they're unaware of their own awfulness, right? Like, I remember I was talking to a guy from Labour a few years back, and I said, you're capable of murder, right? And he goes, no, I'm not. I was like, yeah, you are. You've got 2 arms, 2 legs, and hands. Of course you're capable of murder. And he's like, no, I'm not. I couldn't possibly do that. And now look what's going on out in the streets. People have forgotten the original sin. And so we need to remind every single class of this. Predominantly the ruling class, because everything trickles down from there. And that would require reintroducing them to the classics and also destroying their cynicism. Because the majority of the upper classes, it would seem, and also a large degree of the middle classes, are fundamentally cynical. And that would require the reading of early Christian works. The one that specifically springs to mind is the Epistle of Diognetus. Other works that would need to be read would be St. Augustine again, Aristotle and Plato. In fact, anybody who wants to, say, tell your woke colleagues about non-white authors to read, tell them to read St. Augustine. That might snap them out of it. And then finally, you have the operations of Catholic orders to teach these things, because most people don't know what these are, right? Even amongst the higher classes, they aren't even aware of the classics now. And the people that do read classics, they don't take them seriously. A lot of them. And that would be groups like Opus Dei, the Dominicans, and the Jesuits. Now, the good thing about the really, truly ruling classes is that they aren't these insane SJW types, whereas the middle class largely are. And so, because these people... I've interacted with enough of these SJWs to know that because they think that... I suppose if I give any sort of conservative argument that I'm innately evil, you can't directly attack them head on. You have to redirect them into something else, something saner. And I think that one way of doing this might be to introduce them to Catholic social teaching. But these are just things that I've come up with on the fly. You'd need direct intervention from Jesuits and Dominicans. The Jesuits could do this especially well, because the Jesuits were known in South America for protecting the rights of the slaves. In fact, I recall from a book called The Jesuits, whose author I don't have on hand right now, that one Jesuit even led a slave revolt against the Spanish. You could point them to realities like the Valladolid debate, you could point them to the numerous condemnations of slavery, and you could point them to the copious numbers of non-white saints. And then you can say, well, look where the true social justice is, and then redirect them. This is just me, of course, entirely theorizing just on the fly. And then finally, you'd have to deal with the working classes. And this would involve getting them off of the dependence on lower passions, right? Alcoholism, drug addiction, family destruction. And this is the class that is in the worst state by far. And of course, you couldn't really do this with most of them through, say, the introduction of St. Augustine to them. Most of them don't work in that way. You need to have people around them who are virtuous that they can imitate. And this would involve increased intervention from groups like the Franciscans and the Vincentines spring to mind. In fact, I considered for a little bit of time going to work for the Vincentines for a little bit to help out working class communities in Liverpool, but I never got around to it. I think that they're still accepting people if anybody here is interested. This class especially needs help because they are dying out because of their vices. And because they have nobody there to teach them. Everyone around them is engulfed in this. They have nowhere to look, nowhere to turn. At least in the middle class, they might someday come across a book once upon a time that talks about these sorts of things. Right? The working classes don't really have that so much. They simply aren't that way. So anyway, we're going to be taking questions specifically pertaining to all I've just said. I know that the chat's been very, very active. So if you guys can leave questions, tag me. I will be on the Riot. I will be reading the questions from the Riot first. And I shall be back in a moment because I need to get some water because my mouth is pretty dry from talking for nearly an hour. I'll be back in 2 seconds, everyone. noticed that there are some questions on the riot. The riot is growing very quickly. I know that there are a lot of people on Discord, and we don't know when we're going to get kicked off, so it might be a very good idea to get an account on there sooner rather than later. I'm thinking of also dual streaming this stream through YouTube and also through the radio station, which can be accessed at riot.renaissancemen.xyz through port 8000. That is :8000 after renaissancemen.xyz even. Okay, first question. Thoughts on Fulton Sheen? I really like him, and I think that he will end up being canonized. Pray for that intention, guys, and be sure to ask for his intercession. Thoughts on Ampere mode? I don't think that's realistic, essentially. I don't think it's realistic to go Ampere mode. Allowing goods and services to be freely bought and sold does not necessitate that this applies to all goods and services. Capitalism does not mean that hitmen are legal. Yeah, you're right, but in the absence of a moral framework, what I'm essentially saying is that capitalism is incomplete. What is the best way to help all the people struggling with pornography and lust in general? Both those who realise how bad it is and can't overcome their addictions, and those who don't realise how truly evil porn is. I've struggled with this, as have 90% of men. I once went a stint of about, I'd say, 5 months without it, and I relapsed because of my phone. What I did eventually was I took the battery out of my phone, put it in my student house, and then took the rest of the phone up to my parents' house and left that there. Or my parent house, my mum's house, even. And that has seemingly worked up to this point, and I haven't gone into that sin this year. So that would be something to do. But another thing to acknowledge is that the 9th commandment is one of the real determining factors, because you can still mortally sin through willfully entertaining sexual thoughts, and that will also lead you more likely to acting on them, right? Because if you've got it in thought, you might as well have done it, with your mind. What was it that Christ said? He who lusts after a woman has already committed adultery with her in his heart, or something to that extent. Yeah, you have to keep the thoughts disciplined, and I think that's the mistake that I made the first time around. I didn't realise that I had to do that. So you've got to fight off the thought, and the way that you do that is that you pray. There's a particular line from the Psalms. I think it's Psalm 50, but I can't remember exactly. God, come to my assistance, Lord, make haste to help me. You say it at the beginning of every set of prayers, aside from the introductory on the divine office. And this is a Benedictine tradition. If you're ever tempted or something like that, say, God, come to my assistance, Lord, make haste to help me. And God will, often come to your aid. You sometimes have to, and if he decides not to because he wants you to continue suffering the temptation, then it takes your mind off of it a little bit. A lot of the time with lust, what you have to do is keep focusing on something else, because it just will not go away, right? If you get something like a doubt, that's primarily in the intellect, and so you can just distract things away and it will often go very quickly. Lust will often burn for hours and hours and hours. I know because I've experienced it. What you need to do is focus on something else. Often, what was it Aquinas suggests? Prayer, hard work, reading the scriptures. And also finally, keep good custody of the eyes, because if you look at the parts of a woman, not only are you sinning by staring at a woman in a particularly lustful way because you're reducing her dignity as a person, but also it gives food for thought so that the demons can introduce into your mind at a later date. For those who have quit pornography, you will know what it's like to be harassed by those thoughts. It's dreadful. And that's why people shouldn't even touch that stuff. Right, so we're going to check the last chat. No, that's out. Now I'm going to check the YouTube chat. Okay. So I'm going to start from the start, because there's a lot of different questions throughout. Tag me, please, if you want me to see your question, because there's a lot of... This is a popular stream. What's the difference between the spirit and the soul? Never understood why both are proposed. so far as I remember, spirit is the means by which the soul and the body communicate. It's kind of like an immaterial part of the body, I think. I can't exactly remember. But the soul itself is specifically the intellect and the will, and then the spirit is, lower passions, cunning, those kinds of things. I'm going to correct Son of Tiamat here. Marxism is in fact the opiate of the intellectual. John Nathan asks, how do Orthodox Marxists get a teleology from their materialism? They don't. They don't have a point to their lives. That's why a lot of them are dreadfully unhappy. Since, from what I have heard, the Marxist dialectic says that the end of history is communism, and that is inevitable. Yeah, but there's no purpose inherent in that. That's the problem. Let's see. Continue. Yeah, guys, you should fast. I'm just reading Son of Tiamat's comments here. The last thing a liberal hears before he dies is hey ho. Let's see. We live in a post-industrial age, even though material gain is overly present in liberal republics even. The spiritual and mental health of many of these countries keeps decaying. I need to make a stream tearing into the mental health system because it really, really bugs me. You cannot have a proper mental health system without an idea of what a person is. And we don't have an idea what a person is. How is Christian morality destroying morality? Did I say that by accident at some point? I apologise. I apologise if I said that. I probably just slipped. You know that I tend to typically make, verbal slips, because a lot of the time I'm thinking on the fly and I'm doing different things at the same time, right? But isn't that because capitalism is not a system of philosophy and economic system? No, capitalism is a philosophy. It always was a moral philosophy. You can look at where Adam Smith worked when he was at the University of Glasgow. He was a moral philosopher. It cannot operate on its own, and I think that, I don't know exactly, but I suspect that Adam Smith was just assuming the Presbyterian and Protestant attitude that was in Britain at that time. But you can't actually really do that. That's because of your morality, not the morality of capitalism. Okay, so there's someone arguing for things. Okay. Lol. The comp sci mages will be the first to go Luddite Revolution. Yeah, I'm increasingly feeling that way, actually. But if you've got that work, you do that work. Let's see. I'm gonna find the Phaser article. I'm gonna post it in the chat actually because it's incredible. It is called, for those who cannot see it, who won't see it, it's called Woke Ideology is a Psychological Disorder, and it's on the American Mind. It's well worth a read. And after the stream, you should sit down and actively read it. Because he's written things down and I'm talking, he's naturally going to be more precise in his ideas. But it's not good just for that. It's because Ed Phaser knows this thing in and out in a way that I simply don't. Now, he doesn't propose any solutions, as far as I remember in the article, but it's still well worth a read. Will you debate academic agent? On what? Let's see. Brazil is in a strange place from what I know. In Plato's opinion, what type of government follows after tyranny? Is the tyranny the horrible end of all things? I think so. I can't remember. He only goes through the 5 systems. He goes from aristocracy to democracy to oligarchy to democracy to tyranny. So what I think it is it's just a kind of a reset after that, because everything just gets driven into the ground. It's not Manfred Barthel. I'll go grab it. It wasn't very good, so I'm not recommending the book. No, it's by Jonathan Wright. It's The Jesuits by Jonathan Wright. It's not a very good book. but it was just something that I saw in there, which was quite cool. Have you read the books of globalists like Zbigniew Brzezinski, I assume that's pronounced? The Huxleys, like Aldous Huxley, I presume. Jonas Salk and Bertrand Russell. If you have, how much control does their philosophy have on the modern world? When you realise that Aldous Huxley's Brave New World wasn't a dystopia, that's quite a red pill. Bertrand Russell, his arguments against the existence of God are deserving of a stream in themselves, because they're not very good. They're dumb. They just don't make any sense. He didn't understand what God actually was. Logical positivism itself has been a plague on humanity. Let's see. Yeah, also never give up. Yeah, never ever give up on, you don't have to consent to the temptations that hit you in mind. Yeah, also Psalm 50 counts as an act of contrition. In fact, because it was an act of contrition on the part of King David, who was also a saint. After he took for himself the wife of Uriah, and then had Uriah essentially killed. Do you believe that one way to get away from all this awfulness of today would be a new renaissance, especially the renewal of Christian morality? Not a new renaissance, because the time around the Renaissance was not a moral time, but I think that a renewal in specifically Catholic morality would solve most, well, maybe not most of the problems, but a substantial chunk of them. If people just became Catholic overnight across the world, you'd still have similar problems. But at least you'd have people who were directed at trying to develop their virtues in a more manifest way than they are now. Because nowadays, most of the people that I see are absolutely disinterested in it. As well as also having the direct intervention of the grace of God. If you deny God, God is always going to give you graces. But he loves those who are like unto himself in a greater sense, right? Because you see, the generation of the Trinity is explained by, I think it's Hugh of St. Victor, as the Son being begotten by the Father, and the Father and the Son beholding themselves, and because of both of them being of the divine essence, they immediately fall deeply in love with each other, and the result of that love is the procession of the Holy Spirit. And likewise is God with man. God loves all human beings, but he loves those especially who are more like unto him than those that aren't. Essentially, he loves you insofar as you exist. And if you are like a grievous sinner, then you're going to simply exist less than someone who isn't. Lots of people fed posting in the chat. So I'm going to check that. Oh man, there's a lot of questions. What is the best way to keep an extended family together in light of the societal forces of the modern world which put a strain on those ties? That's a good question, Hassan. You see, the primary thing holding it together is, of course, God. Because God is the beginning and end of all things. If you acknowledge the existence of God in the church, and you have that, as your purpose, God will help you out, and that will sustain you in virtue. But you have to focus on developing the virtues. We cannot have this faith alone sort of society where nobody does anything. There must be a focus on virtue, and the prime virtue, as we hear from St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, I believe, is love. Faith can be as a clanging symbol, but there's nothing without love. And so you must love each other, and to truly love yourself, love those around you, for the sake of God, is to sacrifice yourself as God's only Son. For God's only Son is love, as we hear from the first epistle of John. Right? We must imitate Christ. Christ is our living example. He is, in his incarnation of the flesh and in his actions, the true manifestation of the entire law and what we ought to view as virtuous. Christ is, in his heart dwells the fullness of all virtues. And we see this manifest in his incarnation, his teachings, his crucifixion and death on the cross, and his triumph over death and resurrection. This is the primary way by which we sustain our families, through imitation of Christ. And this, of course, manifests in different ways for different people. We have these things that you can find online called, lists of things that we ought to do in accordance with our state in life. And these vary dependent on who you are. If you are a priest, it's going to be different from a lay religious. If you are a lay religious man, it's going to be different from a lay religious woman. If you are a husband, it's going to be different from a wife. And if you're a child, it is going to be different from a hermit, say. And these must be known above all things. It's all well and good trying to be very virtuous, and I think that's a great thing to pursue. And Aquinas puts it as something like the second highest thing worth attaining to, after before pleasure and after God. But that's all well and good. But if you're not fulfilling that, then you can't expect to sustain an extended family. There must be imitation in Christ of Christ's commandments in all things and his actions in all things. Because the other things like, say for example, securing land for your family so that you have a reliable source of food and income. Making sure that your sons and daughters marry good husbands and wives. Right? Knowing how to make a balance sheet, right? Manage a balance sheet, basic accountancy, being able to work hard, being able to develop in honor and virtue and to have a good reputation. These things, they mean nothing before our final end, first of all. And second of all, they're out of our control a lot of the time. I recall there was a saint, in fact, two saints of the desert. I'll talk about both of them because both of them are pretty pertinent here. One was accused of sleeping with a woman, I can't remember if it was forced or not, and getting her pregnant. And out of humility, he stayed quiet and looked after the woman until she gave birth, and that's when she owned up. And he was sort of set free. Now, this obviously destroyed his reputation, but he continued on anyway. And this was entirely out of his control. Likewise, there was another saint, Saint Vitalis, I think his name was, Saint Vitalis of Gaza, who spent 40 years in the Gazan desert developing virtues, and then went to the city of Alexandria, where he worked as a day labourer. And then he would take the money that he made as a day labourer to buy the time of prostitutes so that he could introduce them to good husbands and to free them up for the religious life, and to teach them the inherent dignity that they have as a daughter of God. He looked at them as brothers and sisters, as sisters. And as a result, this destroyed his name because people assumed, well, the monk has gone AWOL and he's indulging his lower passions, and so he was killed. And all of these prostitutes showed up to his funeral and truly wept, for through him the grace of God worked. And through the grace of God, these women became religious and became good mothers. Now, of course, all of these things that I've just mentioned are very important aside from the stories, but we have to keep focused on that. My spiritual advisor would advise you do cardio exercise every day to burn out your horniness. Well, that's quite a drop. Yeah, that's one way of doing it, but lifting is another thing as well. We should do that. Right, okay, I'm going to check back on the chat. Right. St. Thomas More was an IRE poster. Renaissance, as a good priest knows to put it, was the rebirth of pagan ideas after the Middle Ages. Yeah, even more manifest in the Enlightenment. What does a good economic system look like? One that works. I think that acts of terrorism, Ethan, are not permissible. to put it mildly. I didn't know. Do you by any chance pray the Divine Office or the Little Office of the Blessed Virgin Mary? I was praying the Little Office of the Virgin Mary until I got a Divine Office, and now I'm praying that. Not all of the hours. I miss out nonas and sects, but I miss out terces and sects, but I do the others. Thoughts on Nick Land? I don't really have any, although he is on the list for RSS feeds from the video that I released the other day. You know, for so many people watching, the chat is really not that active. Man, it's all jumping around. Let's see. You should read his books like Grand Chessboard and Between Two Ages. I haven't seen... Oh, what, Russell? Russell. I'm going to have to read him at some point. I'm going to have to. And I'm not looking forward to it. I'm not looking forward to it in the slightest. I already gave my thoughts on Fulton Sheen. I think he'll end up canonised Pete. Yeah, I mean... You know when the FBI report on the guy, or it might have been CIA, I think it was FBI. The FBI report essentially canonizes him that he's a good man. If you want to see testimony to the sanctity of Fulton Sheen, just read his FBI report. You know when the Alphabet Boys are essentially canonizing you on the page that you're a pretty saintly person. Let's see. I'm not sure. Okay, so Nick Fuentes has infused conservative incorporated with America First ideas and seems to be doing well and playing the long institutional game. I'm not sure. I also appreciate the Xavier reference there, Los Copijuez, whatever that means. Let's see if there's any other questions in the chat. If there might be chats further up that I may have missed. Are you RSA born? No, I'm not RSA. I've seen them floating about though. No, it's not that one. Let's see. Right, so let's see if there are any more questions. If not, we will bring it to a close. So I tell you what, we're gonna do. If I can find enough questions, I'll do it for maybe 5 more minutes. And actually, it really depends. We'll go for another couple more minutes anyway. Okay. So Felix the Monarchist asks, any tips for a bad student at a school for programming? You need to spend hours and hours and hours programming. I did it at the age of 13, and so I got it out of the way, but there was a lot of anger there, and I just whacked it out for years, and ground it out regardless of how I felt, and I still did it. That's what you need to do. Grind it out. There's no easy way of learning how to program. What sort of actions can we take aside from praying to dismantle such a terrible organisation? I assume you're talking about Planned Parenthood. Well, you need to stop people needing abortions. It's as simple as that. The only way that you can really destroy an organisation that does abortions is to destroy the demand. Because if you were to simply just undermine the supply, then someone else would come along and make one. Because there are enough abortion-trained doctors for people to set up practices. And I don't think it'd be very hard to acquire capital for such a thing, because people know that abortion is an incredibly lucrative industry. People pay a lot of money to have an abortion, and the resultant the fetus, the baby, is of tremendous use for its. See, I don't even want to say it. It's just disgusting. For use in. Actually, I'm not going to say it. I don't want to say it. It's gross. It's disgusting. Let's see. I know this is a... Oh. John Nathan, I'm not going to read that out, but I'm not surprised it's present, and the reason that you perceive that, and that's regularly perceived, is because that class of people have a tendency to be very well studied. By virtue of the way that their religion operates, there's a lot of reading and a lot of legalism involved. And so therefore they have the habit of reading already there. And also because of the unhealthiness of where they originate from, there's a lot of resentment there. So naturally, these people are not only a very educated class to lead such things, but they also come from an environment that would engender such dispassion, well, maybe not dispassion, but passion. As well as, of course, the rejection of their of the Messiah. Did Bertrand Russell say that in the future the upper classes will force the lower classes to become vegan and become inoculated? I don't know. I have interviewed Dr. Jones. I'll say that. I think I already said my thoughts on Swedenborg in the last one, Son of Tiamat. I don't like him. I mean, as a person, I don't know him, but his views, avoid them. His view of spirituality is if somehow we are able to discern between the good and the evil spirits is fundamentally flawed. You can go and read the life of St. Anthony and you'll know that. A lot of the times an angel of light can be a demon. And it's, from what I recall, Swedenborg didn't believe that. A lot of his writings are the root of the modern New Age as well. I don't think that those books should be touched. Oh, sorry, Miss Wayne. No. What are your thoughts on many important, powerful people such as Russell, Brzezinski, Salk, Galton, Darwin, even Habermas point a specific picture of the future? Was this outcome? I mean, if you mean this utopia or whatever that they wanted, I think that's manifestly not happened. You still mad at Sargon? Do you match his D&D streams? If it's coincidental, I haven't watched Sargon in years. Yeah, the interview's on my channel. It's the second most viewed video. The interview with Dr. Jones. Said Hassan said, I noticed that in the books room you uploaded Said Qutb's Milestones. What do you think we could benefit from reading it? And what are your thoughts on the book so far, if you finished it? I haven't actually started it, but I know roughly of its content, and my thought was that by reading that particular book, you could understand where the Islamic extremism in the modern world comes from. And you could also see one of the reactions against modernity as well. So, yeah, I still need to go through it. Yeah, I just saw Hassan. Okay, so I'm going to bring this to a close, I think, unless there's any more questions. I don't think there are that I can see. So, for those who have extra questions, of course, the questions room on the Riot is where you are to stick them. You can make an account pretty easily at riot.renaissancemen.xyz. For those who are having problems with your phone, because there's a phone app for it, you need to set the home server as matrix.renaissancemen.xyz first before you connect to the Riot. So I might make a video on this, because I already made a video on setting up RSS feeds so you can get proper notification on streams and such. Yeah, but anyway, thank you very much for watching. Please stick the questions in there next. And I think that the next stream will be on Happy Clappy Christianity and on Hillsong. And I suppose sort of a quasi-response to Protestantism. In essence, the only part of the Protestant Bibles that are not divinely inspired is the contents page. I'll leave that as some sort of as a kind of prefigurement maybe of the stream. I'll see you guys later, and goodbye. Thank you for watching.